Today marks the first Sunday of our summer theme, in which we'll be exploring various faces and people of the Bible. And I could not be more thrilled to begin this Sunday with the story of Noah. And one of the reasons I'm so thrilled to begin with that story is because it isn't too often here at Hancock that you get to hear two sermons back to back that begin with a Bill Cosby skit. But it's true, because I couldn't talk about Noah without somehow pulling in the 60s Bill Cosby skit where he invokes the character of Noah. Now, a lot of you might know this, but I'm going to do my best here to recreate this. So, Cosby presents Noah in a workshop, apparently sawing away, when the voice of the Lord cuts in. Noah. Noah. Yeah, what? Noah, build me an ark. Noah, put one of every animal in it. And the skit kind of continues that way, and every time Cosby responds with, right. Well, he eventually relents and builds the ark. Noah's neighbors eventually complain because the ark's in his driveway. And Noah ends up complaining himself because God never told him he'd have to clean up after the animals. You see, the bit works because we can easily imagine a Noah who simply couldn't believe God was calling him to do this. At least when God calls Moses in the Exodus story out of that burning bush, Moses tries to get God to send his brother Aaron instead. All our Bible tells us that Noah did was exactly all that the Lord had commanded of him. He doesn't put up a fight, ask any questions, or even seemingly think twice about the decision. Now, as a minister, I know many of you simply assume that I'm much more in the mold of the biblical Noah than the Bill Cosby Noah. As soon as God calls, I unwaveringly respond. Okay, well, I don't have to tell you that's probably not true. And I suspect you don't think that of me. In truth, I live somewhere between the biblical Noah and the Bill Cosby Noah. I believe being in conversation with God helps us ensure that we simply haven't created God in our image. And when I look around this church to each of you, I think we're also a people who exist in between these 2 points. I think we value a faith that encourages us to question exactly where God might be leading us. Now, I wasn't among you 5 years ago or so when you began the discernment about where God's leading you. I wasn't here when God spoke to this community and each of you and called you to widen the welcome and take on this major accessibility project. I'm not sure who out there among you and who at home felt more like the biblical Noah and who felt more like Bill Cosby saying, right. And maybe each of you felt like a bit of both at some point in this process. But here we are today, 5 or so years later, and it's been a particularly long year in our calling. And I wouldn't blame anyone who looks around today, particularly at the back of our sanctuary, and think, what has God called us into? Well, the Bible tells us that Noah simply did everything that God commanded. It doesn't tell us what Noah might have felt like in the middle of his journey. Sure, Bill Cosby makes jokes about it, and jokes that surprisingly ring true, but I wonder how Noah might have felt right in the middle of all the messiness of God's call. How did he feel when he had to cut down yet another tree? Woods and trees and pitch everywhere, measuring out endless number of whatever those cubits are. And that doesn't even begin to address the animals. How did his family cope with the frustrations of living into God's calling? But you see, this isn't just a story about God calling us into the messiness of life. It's also about the power of faithful relationship. This isn't simply just a story about a flood. It isn't just about God's anger and justice. It's about God's faithfulness. It's about trusting that when God speaks to us and we respond to God's call, God doesn't abandon us, but sees us through. If you happen to have read anything recently about the movie industry, you might have seen that 2014 has been dubbed by some as the year of the Bible, in Hollywood at least. Seeing the success of various TV endeavors and the Passion of the Christ, now a decade old, many Hollywood studios have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into a set of biblical-based movies set to arrive over this year. At the end of this year, you'll see Christian Bale, most famous for recently playing Batman, star as Moses in a $150 million epic about the Exodus. However, the first of these blockbusters to hit the cinemas was a movie called Noah, a $125 million adaptation starring Russell Crowe. Now, this film, if you've seen it, is quite certainly an adaptation of the biblical story. It pulls in other biblical themes and other biblical characters, and there's even a few brand new people, because you have to have a villain after all. And while many derided these additions, I personally found them in the spirit of the Jewish tradition of Midrash. Midrash being that ancient practice of storytelling and teaching through filling in the gaps of biblical narrative. Now, as one might expect, the result of the Hollywood Midrash, if you will, is often an excuse for battle scenes and love interests. But there are moments when a few theologically interesting things happen. Well, the writers could have easily depicted God as that traditional booming voice from heaven calling out to Noah, "Build me the ark." Instead, God came to Noah in a dream. And after the dream, Noah awoke feeling like something had been placed upon his heart, and he knew what he had to do. But when he questions what he had seen, what God might be asking of him, he goes to speak with his grandfather Methuselah, and that's actually a biblically accurate relationship. And when he questions his call to Methuselah, Methuselah responds like this: "Noah, he speaks to you. You must trust that he speaks in ways you understand. So you tell me, can this be avoided?" Listen, I don't know if God actually flooded the earth and deemed only one family righteous enough to save. Yet for me, that isn't the most important part of the story, because the story of Noah, the story of his family, and this flood isn't just about the flood. It's a story much more intimate than that. It's a story intimate to us because, not simply because of Sunday school or CCD, it's intimate to us because it's a story about calling and about faithful relationship. It's a story about who we are individually and who we are as a church. Throughout our lives, God calls us to things that seem impossible. God calls us in ways that we discern individually, in ways we discern together, to build inconceivably large arcs, and then asks us to live in them, sometimes for 40 days, sometimes 150 days, sometimes much longer. Responding to God's call is often messy and filled with uncertainty, yet the story doesn't end with the calling. It's also a story wrapped in faithful relationship, for when God called Noah and his family to this crazy idea, he didn't leave them out to sea. When God called us to be a more accessible house of worship, God doesn't abandon us in our ark. When God trusts that we have a calling and places it on our lives and things get messy, God hasn't forgotten us. Alternatively, as we heard in the reading, the Bible tells us that God remembered Noah and his family in the midst of that flood. But see, God didn't remember Noah and their family like we remember to pick up milk from the store. The biblical scholar Everett Fox translates the Hebrew passage to say that God paid mind to Noah, but even that seems to fall short. Rather, I think God remembered Noah like the ways in which we somehow remember our oldest ancestors when we stand on a mountaintop or at the edge of the sea. God remembered Noah and his family as we celebrate every saint in time and beyond time when we celebrate communion or recite the Lord's Prayer. When God calls and we respond in faith, the relationship between Creator and creation grows more tangible, more palpable, and we come to understand that we have not been forgotten, but are remembered. So today, as we live amongst tarps and tape and plywood and dust, the literal kind behind us and among us, and the metaphorical kind that holds the fragile pieces of our hearts together, let us remember that God has not forgotten us and continues to speak to us even now, today, helping heal our hearts and guiding us as we live in the midst of change. Sometimes in life, change sneaks up on us and it's painful. Sometimes in life, God calls in our hearts and it's exciting. And no matter what way, sometimes we respond like Bill Cosby's Noah, and sometimes like the biblical Noah, and sometimes right in the middle. But no matter how we respond, what's important to remember is that God remains faithful. So as we begin this summer, and you begin to discern how God might be calling to you in this time, speaking to you in ways that honor your relationship, trusting that you understand the ways God speaks to you, I invite you to trust in God's faithfulness and respond to that call. Some of you will hear God's call leading you away for the summer. Some of us might even send doves and ravens in the coming month to see if the waters have receded a bit before returning. And that's okay, because one day soon the dove will return with that olive branch leaf, and that raven won't return at all because it's found home on dry land. Just as God's faithful relationship lives in your hearts, it lives in this church. And even though it isn't the future yet, we know how this and all of God's stories end. The water recedes, the rainbow arcs the sky, and God's faithfulness endures. Amen.